ask each of the panel members just to join me up here for a moment. And I know we don't have long before the next session, but we do have some time for questions and answers. While they're settling in, I'll just let you know quickly, there's a World Tunnelling Congress on in Naples in May. Not something that most of the people in the audience would normally attend, but this year they have a high emphasis on art, architecture and archaeology, and they're running a number of parallel sessions that look a lot at, when we do these major infrastructure projects in cities, how do we consider and integrate and react to art, architecture and archaeology. So, and I know that several of us will be there and speaking as well. So have a look. If you want a couple of days in Naples, you don't have to come to the whole conference. There are parallel sessions that Han and Antonia are running. They're actually in the Bourbon tunnels, and we're going to talk a lot about some of these interesting themes there. So does anyone have any questions? I can bring a mic to you, or no? Oh, there's one more. Any questions?
Hi, I'm Sam. I work with EDF Energy, but I'm more here out of my personal interest. I'm just curious more from an infrastructure perspective about your thoughts on the boring company, the tunneling company in California. Because I've heard some people be skeptical about it, thinking that it's just a lot of hype for something that's not very practical. And I was just wondering what your perspectives were on that.
Should we take turns answering this? Perhaps starting with who's smiling the most at this delicious question?
For me, the Boring Company is a very good example on how to get your marketing right. It really it fascinates me how a concept that's been around since Brunel, which is basically how we make tunnels, can be hyped into something that is now going to save society. And what's most interesting is that it predicts that we are going to stay using our cars for the coming 20 to 50 years, and therefore we need to build all these extreme tunnels kind of thing. Whereas the thinking I hear amongst urban planners is that as the automated vehicles come into force, the personal car ownership, which we now all still cling to, even the younger generation is much less likely to own a car, and it will develop much more into sharing cars and different ways of moving about. So all in all, I think and actually we write about this in our book as well, that the concept is interesting, but it's trying to sub-optimize in the last 2 or 3 years of a project. Whereas if you really want to speed up things, you need to do something at the beginning of the project cycle, because these projects usually take 10 or more years to complete.
Christian, anything?
Yeah, I can. I think it's very good that they brought this tunnelling aspect to mainstream discussion. That's good. It looks like it might bring costs down because of what they're thinking, and I think that's also interesting. How you apply it, it doesn't feel like it's really thought through as a planned approach to infrastructure. It's just sort of, here's some interesting toys, what can we do with them? It feels a little bit to me. They are trying to look at rapid transit systems connecting airport and city centres using the things he's developing, and I think that's interesting. However, when you look at those kind of transport models which are effectively just taking a private vehicle type model and putting it underground, those are trickle systems really. They're not mass transit. They don't really start to get to the crux of solving cities' problems. It just moves them from where they are already to somewhere else. It doesn't change the nature of them. So mass transit in a public sense, I don't think it starts to, at least in the way it's put forward, address that. But I do think there's a space for everybody developing interesting ideas, interesting technology, interesting concepts. I hold my hat off to that and think, let's think how we can apply some of those things, but hopefully in a better planned way.
I think from an urban planning perspective, I guess my personal thoughts are that if they can save time and money on tunnelling projects to the quantum that they're talking about, that would be very impressive. I think that there are some potential benefits if you could apply it along very high density, well-trafficked routes with Hyperloop, and you combine the two potentially. My concerns about the boring company partly relate to two things. The first is an assumption that it's just a blank sheet of paper below ground, and we have this kind of gold rush mentality, or as Han and Antonia have said before, the first come, first served approach. So it's an assumption that I'm going to be able to just go beneath the surface of a city, take the bits that I need out of it, and get from A to B. And the reality is there's actually a very complex picture under there. So one of the things that we discussed at Think Deep UK, and we'll have a workshop on in May, is the governance of the subsurface. So how do we manage this gold rush? Do we have three-dimensional spatial plans? Do we have something like the law of the seas to govern what goes where in relationship to other things? Secondly, from a spatial planning perspective, how do we integrate things vertically as well as laterally? And when the car lifts come up from the tubes below ground, what kind of pedestrian experience does that create? And what trade-offs are there between the vehicles that are coming up and down out of the boring company tunnels to the surrounding streetscapes? What kind of head houses are there? What else has to stop their progress from point A to point B to make way for those vertical movements? So I think it's really good because it's got everyone talking, and there is a lot of intelligence and a lot of creativity there, which I think is great. But again, it's always discussing all these details. So.
Yeah, a lot has been said from the panelists, but I just want to add that our industry, or let's say the tunneling industry as such, even though we've made great advancements, we're actually, compared to other industries, not the most progressive and not the ones that adapt to technological advancements the quickest. So in that sense, someone like the boring company can actually disrupt our way of thinking and challenge us to say, are we really the best and the quickest and the most cost-effective the way we construct? So I think it's a good thing overall.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Will. So I was really interested by the idea of kind of taking underground spaces which are currently unproductive and reinventing them for new purposes. And I was particularly curious about two avenues here. One is the use of unused underground spaces for underground farming, like hydroponics. And the other was the use of large vertical underground spaces for things like energy storage using, I think it's called gravitricity, where you use very heavy blocks and you let them rise and fall to actually store energy. Both of these avenues have opportunities for freeing up space on the surface that would otherwise be used for farming or otherwise be used for kind of large battery storage projects. I was just wondering if anyone on the panel has any kind of thoughts on that or examples of that they found interesting, or any comments at all.
I'll kick off, although I know there's some topics that we're all a little familiar with. So growing underground here in London, hydroponic farm 33 metres below Clapham Common, former air raid shelter, was briefly used for accommodation during the Windrush generation, then for document storage, and now through LED lighting has found this, and a great deal of foresight, creativity and hard work, I should say, by the founders, is now a place that's creating food with very few food miles. So that's an innovative example of retrofitting an underground space in an unexpected way. I think each space is different and has its own set of challenges, and the team behind Growing Underground were very brave in putting themselves out there, and I think that the way that we raise funds for new businesses these days is changing, and that's maybe supporting some of that creativity. But after going through the process with TfL, building up trust, establishing that would work, that might make it possible to find other underutilised spaces that are more flexible. I'll hand over to the panel, but I would just say briefly that we did a site visit or a tour of Down Street Underground Station in Mayfair about 2 years ago, and that's a lateral space that was on the market from TfL property, but it's extremely constrained in terms of how wind moves through the space, the security relationship with the Piccadilly line. But there are all of these places that I think that cities should get do a stock take of, understand what you have, what the opportunities and the constraints are, how can you vertically integrate these site. So I think that there is a great opportunity for some clever reuse of spaces in our cities.
You mentioned about lighting and the use of lighting to grow plants. That is one of the areas of challenges actually that we have encountered so far, that there is very little research about what kind of LEDs or what lighting really works to enhance the plant growth. And that is one of the challenges that we have faced because there seem to be so much, not in the spaces that we usually end up designing, that we end up with hydroponics or something very, very technical in terms of agriculture. But we tend to be encountered a lot with the vertical green walls these days as a feature in office spaces and hotels and things like that. And the only thing that we get so far from our landscape colleagues is that just provide a standard white light and that will be enough for these plants to grow. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So I think there is still a little room for research there about what light really works for this cultivation.
I think from a general perspective, it's not a question if we should use those spaces. We really need to do that. And I think if we look at on a worldwide scale, we are losing so much agricultural land, arable land, at such an enormous rate that the question really is, where's our food going to come from? So when we talk about things like resilient cities, food security is one of the aspects as well. And this might not be a problem for a city like London, but there are cities out there that actually have a great problem in getting food into the city and supplying the city with sufficient food. So if you are able to actually create even part of that through using existing underground spaces or others, that would be great. So, eventually maybe the tunnels that Mr. Musk is making with the tunnel boring company can also be used to produce food or something like that. In terms of energy, I think one of the interesting schemes, what you mentioned is we're looking for ways to store energy because we're producing a lot of energy at times when we don't need it, etc. I think one of the interesting things is that we might actually start looking at our old mines again, and the mine shafts particularly, because those go down deep enough for these type of systems to be developed. So we might well find that in our historic industrial sites below the surface, if you like, which were all closed down, could actually play a crucial role, not only in terms of alternative energy and energy storage, but also as proposed recently to produce food. And I think it was the mines in Wales that they were looking at to see whether or not they could be used for food production as well. So these are all very exciting developments, but they underline, I think, that the role the subsurface and underground space could well play into the future to actually create resilience to us, bring resilience to our cities and maintain them in the long term as well.